For those not familiar with the Good Governance Academy, we're a non-profit organisation that was established by Professor Mervyn King back in 2019. We collaborate with universities, business schools, professional bodies and other organisations around the world to educate and empower leadership to drive ethical and sustainable change. We run regular webinars on current topics, and if you'd like to see what we have planned, please head over to our events page, which I'll post a link to in the chat window. I'd also encourage you to join our mailing list and follow us on LinkedIn to be kept informed of forthcoming events. In addition to the webinars, we host a colloquia twice a year. Our 13th event will be held on the 15th of May. Registrations will soon be open for that on our website. These are high-profile events which have been attended by tens of thousands of people. The output of these is actually shared with over 5 million professionals throughout our support member network. We also run showcase events to promote courses which have been endorsed by the Academy. The endorsement program is available to any organisation, and it involves a robust assessment to ensure that the highest standards are maintained. The courses that we endorse are those that we feel address business critical issues and provide users with current and relevant content. Our next showcase is on the 17th of March and will feature an ESG competence program by future boards in Norway. Today's webinar is part of our Interesting Advancements program and focuses on the importance of stakeholder engagement plans. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the Partnership for Transparency and the World Bank, who are helping to create sustainable change with these investment projects. So I'd like to hand over now to our first guest, Asla Gurkan, who is a social development specialist for the World Bank. So a warm welcome to you, Asla. Thanks so much for being here today. Can I hand over to you now for an introduction before you share the work that you've been doing with the World Bank?
Sure, and thank you, Mark, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be connecting from. My name is Aslı Gürkan. I am currently Senior Social Development Specialist at the World Bank. I'm originally from Turkey, but I've been living in the US for probably the last 20 years. And I'm currently in the Social Development Department of the World Bank, based in our headquarters. But you may know that the World Bank is the largest development organization in the world. We have about 130 country offices. So with that, I will please ask Evelyn to turn on the slides. Next slide, please. Yes, so today Vinay and I will talk to you about the World Bank's Stakeholder Engagement Policy, which is quite an important policy, not only for World Bank funded projects, but also for development projects around the world in general. And so I will kick off with telling you a bit about how this policy came about, how the World Bank characterizes stakeholders, and also show you some examples of good stakeholder engagement practices in World Bank funded projects, as well as some poor stakeholder engagement practices that we've seen. And then I will hand over to Vinay to tell you a bit more about how your organization, you personally and your organization, can engage in stakeholder engagement design and implementation. So with that, next slide, please. Okay, so maybe before we even get into who the stakeholders are and how they're considered, I want to tell you that the whole stakeholder engagement policy came about in the World Bank more prominently with the introduction of the environmental and social framework. I don't know if you're familiar with this framework, but it was introduced in the bank in 2018. And you can think of this as the World Bank Sustainability Framework that applies to all investment operations that we finance around the World Bank. It has 10 standards, which ranges from assessing environmental and social risks, labor and working conditions, community health and safety, cultural heritage. And as part of these 10 standards, one of our standards is on stakeholder engagement and information disclosure. So according to this policy, the way that the World Bank characterizes and categorizes stakeholders in its in the projects that it funds is in threefold. The first group of stakeholders are called project affected people. This could mean either negatively affected or positively affected by a project. An example of that would be, for instance, that would be a negatively affected group would be, let's say, if a project is funding roads and some families have to be displaced because of that. So that would be an example of project affected party in the negative sense. But also the positively, of course, means the project beneficiaries, local communities in the directly impacted project area. The second category is called the other interested parties. These groups are not directly impacted by the project in a positive or a negative sense, but these are groups who consider their interests as being indirectly impacted. So a lot of those, let's say, civil society organizations who operate in the zone, in the project zone, would be considered other interested parties. You could have business owners who are interested in the development of the zone. Or also other donors who are also funding projects in that zone. And then the third group of stakeholders are called disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. And of course, this definition could vary depending on what project we're talking about. But it basically means, it basically refers to groups that are disproportionately impacted by the project, or could be at the highest risk of being left out of project benefits if targeted measures or special engagement efforts are not put in place from the start. And we can think of some examples like persons with disabilities, or perhaps migrants and refugees in certain country contexts, etc. Next slide, please. So the way that the World Bank, the other way, if you can, and the next one. Yes. So the way that the World Bank defines stakeholder engagement according to its policy is that it's an inclusive process of building and maintaining constructive relationships with stakeholders on an ongoing basis throughout the project cycle, in a way that their views are taken into account and that their concerns are addressed. And the reason sort of why it came about in the first place is that because there's belief, and there's of course evidence, there's decade of development work that have shown that successful stakeholder engagement really can contribute to successful design and implementation of a development project by making project interventions much more responsive to the needs and concerns and expectations of the communities. And also, there is particularly a terminology that's used in the private sector, which is social license to operate. So the stakeholder engagement can also help with better project acceptance and social license to operate through a mutual understanding and trust building that can start at the outset. And then also just another point that I want to make is that our policy mandates grievance redress mechanism as part of stakeholder engagement. So this also helps to make sure that community grievances are managed appropriately and with an aim to prevent conflicts and project delays. Next slide, please. So I mentioned at the beginning that we have 10 standards that make up our environmental and social framework. In many of these standards, there is one sort of document that is linked to that standard, where the clients, or when we say clients, these are usually our government counterparts, are responsible for preparing and implementing. So for our standard 10 on stakeholder engagement, the relevant document for the standard is called the Stakeholder Engagement Plan. This is not a World Bank's document. This is a government's document which we provide support to the government in preparing and implementing, but it is a publicly available document which is prepared to describe the timing and methods of engagement that the borrower has committed to do throughout the project cycle. And and on the right-hand side, what you see is that the content of this plan, we won't get into too much of these details at this point, but I wanted to mention that some of the things that you would see in these plans are, for instance, a mapping of stakeholders according to the 3 categories that I mentioned at the beginning. you'll see some summary of the stakeholder engagement that is done during the preparation and what people have said and what people are expecting from the project. And also in good stakeholder engagement plans, you'll also see how the project teams are responding to it, or what is it that they're committing to that corresponds with some of the things they're hearing from their stakeholders at the beginning. Also, you'll see things like the budget that is being foreseen to be able to implement the stakeholder engagement plan, staffing arrangements, some staffing responsibilities that the client is committing to put in for the success of this stakeholder engagement plan, as well as a section on grievance mechanisms. Usually you will see different steps of the grievance mechanism that will be implemented in the project. Next slide, please. So, I mean, we have many examples of good stakeholder engagement practices from projects. I will just share one with you. This is from Nigeria, a climate resilience project. It has been approved by the board of directors, the World Bank board of directors in 2021. So it should be about in its 4th year of implementation. And the objective of this project is to increase sustainable landscape management practices in targeted watersheds in northern Nigeria. What's good practice about this project is that it really goes beyond the minimum of doing some sporadic public consultations, which is sometimes what we see in a project, but it takes it a bit forward to actually have support project implementation committees made of community members, which then these community members help with participatory design, implementation, and monitoring of watershed management plans and other activities that are funded by the project. Also, this project has helped the communities by equipping the communities with GRS-enabled digital cameras. So it's a good example of use of technology. And then whatever is recorded through these cameras are actually used to monitor the physical progress of the civil works. And also they're shared with a third-party implementer and third-party monitoring and evaluation entity that is hired under this project. And all this use of technology and participatory implementation is also complemented with what we would consider more traditional ways of engagement, meaning, you know, regular face-to-face meetings at the village level, inclusion of village elders and other community members that are in position of authority. And also, what's good about this project is that there is a stakeholder engagement indicator that is directly in the results framework of the project. And what that means is that, you know, at the end of its 5-year project cycle, one of the ways in which the success of this project will be assessed will be through this indicator. And this indicator is basically a number of integrated watershed management plans completed with community participants. Next slide.
Asla, can I just quickly ask?
Sure.
You mentioned there that there's the project manager.
Yes.
Are these people part of the World Bank, or are they part of PTF, or are they local organizations?
So the project management teams these are government officials.
Okay.
So for the World Bank, usually our primary interlocutor on the government side is the Ministry of Finance. This is where, you know, Ministry of Finance is the entity that we sign our legal agreements with. But then after that, it goes into an implementer. So when we talk about project implementation unit, these are usually the relevant ministry who's implementing the project.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So, so the slide that I showed you before was an example of good stakeholder engagement, robust stakeholder engagement, the kind of examples we'd like to see more in World Bank funded projects. But we also know that there are equally examples of stakeholder engagement that is not done to its intended levels, and I would call probably poor stakeholder engagement. And the point that, you know, I want to make, and we're trying to make in the institution as social development specialists in the World Bank, is that doing poor stakeholder engagement not only has social implications or, some social exclusion related implications, but it has real economic costs for the project teams, for investors. So, and for instance, what are some of the concrete costs, economic costs that we see when stakeholder engagement is not done right? I mean, one of the main things that we see is that you'll see much higher levels of community opposition if communities are not brought into the project thinking, project design at the outset, which can then result in, for instance, massive cost overruns. This is something we've seen in a power transition project in the Caucasus, for example. And then you'll see, main project delays. If you look at roads project in Latin America, things that are linked to poor stakeholder engagement have really led to project delays. And of course, that means contract changes, increased, lost time, increased land values. And of course, with project delays, this is massive, increase of costs if you're thinking of these mega large development projects. We also know, especially from the mining sector over the decades, that poor stakeholder engagement can really lead to even project cancellations altogether, or just mismatched measures, inadequate mitigation measures. For example, here, the example that I put for you is from Peru. You have situations where whole, pedestrian and cattle crosses are built and highways, but they're not in the right place because the time is never, taken to properly consult what would be a good way to build things like this. And then finally, I think from the World Bank side, poor stakeholder engagement has real reputational costs. And also when we look at inspection panel cases, an inspection panel is an independent complaint mechanism of the World Bank, which usually looks at, which is a mechanism that's in place to keep World Bank to account. And when we look at inspection panel cases over the years, one of the main reasons as to why these cases are brought to the panel's attention is because of poor stakeholder engagement. So with this, I will turn over to Vinay to tell you more about how you can invite, you and your organization can engage in stakeholder engagement implementation. Over to you, Vinay. Thank you.
Sorry, Azla, can I just jump in a second before we hand over? What do you see as being the common reasons for poor stakeholder engagement? Is it like a process breakdown? Just are there common themes that you see come up again and again?
Yes. So I think one reason that we see is just the times of, the project cycle itself. And because we know that good stakeholder engagement, it takes time, right? It's a process. You have to take time to build a process that's inclusive. And I think many times the project preparation schedules are rushed. They're decreasing. So there's a tendency to do things that are just quick and easy and thinking that they can be done later on. But we know, and sometimes they can. And I think there are also situations where there are risks to doing stakeholder engagement too early, right? When you don't know a lot of things about the project and you may raise expectations that are a little immature. But I think at the same time, as these examples that I have here on the slide have shown, that there's a real value in engaging early when you're thinking of project designs and project concepts, because then it becomes much harder and much costlier to try to fix those issues later on. So I would say one is that, and the other is there's a real, I would say, shortage of specialists in this area, right? Because many times the people who are meant to do stakeholder engagement in communities these are technical people. They know very well, they know the roads projects, they know their technical area, but it doesn't mean that they have the needed skills to do these participatory processes at the community level. And then I would just mention the third thing as trust issues. Sometimes there are really long-term trust deficits between the governments and communities. So then you can send the most skilled expert to do this, but there's a whole context around this. So I think it's also important to, it's not just what you do and how you do it, but also who is the messenger, right? Who is the person facilitating these dialogues? So I think when some of these things are not in place, then the likelihood of stakeholder engagement not being robust and inclusive, I think the risk of that becomes higher.
Wonderful, thank you. So sorry, Vinay, if I can, we'll hand over to you now for an introduction, and then you can carry on through the presentation. And then we'll do questions and answers at the end. If anyone does have any questions, please pop them in the question box and we'll make sure that they get answered.
Thank you, Asla, and thank you, Mark. My name is Vinay Bhargav, and I am the Chief Technical Advisor at PTF. PTF is an international NGO with headquarters in Washington, but we have affiliates in Manila, Philippines, in Europe, and a team based in Zambia. We are mostly volunteers who have worked in international institutions such as the World Bank. I myself worked in the World Bank for more than 20 years. And what we are now doing is to bring our expertise and make it available to civil society, along with funding that we try to mobilize. So we provide technical assistance as well as advice and grants to help the local CSOs fight corruption and increase transparency and accountability. Therefore, we have a natural interest in the potential of stakeholder engagement plans to make it more effective, because it is in line with the mission to create more accountability and transparency and development effectiveness. We have been working in more than 160 CSOs in more than 50 countries, and we have been around for almost 50 years. Next slide, please. So, as Asla mentioned, in the stakeholder engagement, there are three different roles. One is by the project implementing agencies, which are usually government organizations who design, implement, and finance the stakeholder engagement. It is their primary responsibility to do good stakeholder engagement and avoid poor stakeholder engagement, because they are the ones who have to bear all the costs, and the public has to bear all the costs of poor stakeholder engagement. The World Bank role is to approve the stakeholder engagement plan and to monitor and guide its implementation during the implementation of projects. And the projects typically will take 4 to 5 years to implement, so it is a medium-term process. The civil society role is to participate as a stakeholder in its own right, as well as to help the communities, because as we all know, in civil society, many of us are there to serve our communities. Therefore, you serve the communities by helping them engage more effectively as stakeholders and to defend their rights. Next slide, please. Now, Evelyn, I have animation on them, so down arrow will get us there. So the CSOs can play crucial roles in the stakeholder engagement. And what we recommend is that the civil society organizations work constructively with the government agencies and the World Bank to make a real difference in the lives of the communities and make the projects more serve their needs. We are not keen to promote any adversarial role, but a constructive engagement role. And civil society organizations, in our experience, are welcomed by government organizations when they are constructively engaging to help them do a better job. So Asla has already mentioned, you can engage as a stakeholder, you can act as a social intermediary to help the project affected people. And the third one, which is a service provider to project implementing agencies. For many projects, the government implementing agencies expect to contract civil society organizations to deliver certain services. Now, I will be the first one to say that not all civil society organizations want to be contractors to the government, and that is perfectly all right. But there are some who are willing to provide services in the interest of serving their communities and serve on contracts with the implementing agencies. Now, there are many roles civil society organizations can play. They can facilitate, participate, train, collect feedback, monitor, advocate. Not all of these need to be done in a single project, and not all of these need to be done by any single CSO, because imagine the portfolio of the World Bank finance projects around the world is about $400 billion with more than 2,500 projects in more than 100 countries. And in your own country, the whole country may be covered by a single project, and the portfolio may be billions of dollars. There is no way one single civil society organizations can handle the stakeholder engagement, even in one project. Forget about the portfolio of projects in a country. Therefore, you can choose and you can serve in your community, in your area, in a sector, and you can pick the role you want to pick. So I think it will take a collective effort of many civil society organizations to do effective stakeholder engagement. Now, to do that, next slide, please.
Sorry, Vinay, if I can just jump in again.
Sure.
Just a question about the stakeholder groups. Do they all have the same kind of power and influence? So if they have objections or things that they want to raise, do they all have the same effectiveness?
I think the first and foremost, the stakeholders who are project affected people have the most rights.
Okay.
On this next slide, I'm talking about the rights. So they have the most rights, but they can be helped by civil society organizations to assert their rights. And then civil society organizations also have rights in their own standing. So they can speak on behalf of the communities, or they can speak on their own behalf. So first right is to have relevant and timely information. And it is more important to focus that the information should be an understandable formal language. We have seen too many examples where the government bureaucratic language and the World Bank language is dumped on the stakeholder and somehow expect them to understand it. That is not acceptable. The stakeholders have a right to demand it in an understandable form, language, and accessible place. The second is that consultation have to be meaningful. Too many times, the bad practice is to just check the box, call the people to a meeting, say I have done the consultation, go home, maybe serve them tea and biscuits, and that's it. And that's not meaningful consultation. Meaningful consultations requires what the line says, continuous reporting. And this is required by the World Bank, that the implementing organizations should record the feedback and what their response is. And they should do it not one time, one meeting, but over the life of the project. The third is that there is a grievance mechanism which the project affected people can access to lodge their concerns. It is like a complaint mechanism. Many governments have it. Question is it accessible? Is it understandable? Is it user friendly? And is it responsive? So those rights are there. And contact information of those who are responsible for stakeholder engagement implementation should be publicly available in an accessible place. So you know who to go to and who to ask. So these are the stakeholder rights. Now, stakeholder remedies come from, first of all, every country has its own laws and regulations about public participation. And those vary from country to country, and one can well rely on them. But in addition to that, the World Bank has tools and policies to prevent retaliation and victimization. So I think if you feel that by speaking out openly, government is going to retaliate or is retaliating, one can access to the World Bank retaliation reprisal policy and have remedies there. The third is that the World Bank has set up three levels of accountability mechanisms which can be accessed by stakeholders, particularly the project affected people. One is access to information policy. And mind you that according to the law, the World Bank policies take precedence in a World Bank finance project over the government's own policies. So that is by law, that otherwise the World Bank has a right to suspend the project. So access to information policy is one of them. Then you have the uh, grievance redress service, which is a service offered by the World Bank, that if people have grievances which they believe that the government is not addressing, they can go to this dispute resolution mechanism. And third, there is a judicial process called inspection panel, where the project affected people can go and say, look, the World Bank is not complying with its own policy, and that is doing harm to us. And they can present their, with the help of lawyers and civil society organizations, they can present their case to the inspection panel. And it has been around for decades. So I think there is a case history on this, and there are many cases which do go to inspection panel. But as far as possible, they should first be resolved at the by the grievance redress service. Next slide, please. Now, how can the civil society organizations engage in a stakeholder engagement plan? First is during the design of the stakeholder engagement plan. The policy requires that all stakeholders, including the civil society organizations, can participate in the consultations, should have the access about the project in a form and language accessible to them and understandable to them. And during those consultations, they can express their views and help their community members express their views and demand that their views are responded to. They can also advocate for success factors. I don't have slide number 7 here, but they include, for example, adequate budget. It is required that there should be explicit budget for a stakeholder engagement plan. Now, some will, if there is not adequate budget, you can be sure that the poor stakeholder engagement is more likely than not. So, and by participating across the projects, you can see some projects allocate 0.1% of the project cost as a stakeholder engagement. Others may devote as much as 1% to 2%. So clearly the effort that goes into it will vary. So, and you can demand and push for that. You can push for explicit roles for civil society organizations. Asla mentioned the trust issues, particularly when the trust with the government is low. Civil society organizations can serve as a very solid intermediary. Now, during the stakeholder engagement implementation, the CSO role is first of all to monitor the gaps between the promise and the reality. The stakeholder engagement plan has, some of them are quite elaborate. They have a standardized format recommended by the World Bank. They should say what information will be disclosed, when, how, and where, and in what languages, etc. Is it being done during implementation? Is the budget consultations being done as promised? Are they including the marginalized and vulnerable groups? Are they being done in indigenous people languages? All of those are required. If they are short circuiting these, then they're taking shortcuts. This can be monitored, and effort should be put into closing the gaps. Then where the civil society organizations are welcomed by project implementing agency to provide contractual services, civil society organizations can show their interest and participate in the tendering process. And finally, very important is the civil society organizations, which are usually better trusted by the public citizens than the government organizations, can independently collect feedback on how the project is going and how it is affecting the people, and use that data to make it public and have advocate closing of the gaps and improving the services. So these are some examples of it. Next, please. Next slide. To finish, the first thing I would say is that this policy, which has been in effect since 2018, the stakeholder engagement policy, is the most significant institutionalized opportunity for the civil society to engage in the World Bank finance projects, which, as I mentioned, amount to more than 2,500 projects, $400 billion, and every year, almost $100 billion worth of projects are approved, new projects are approved. So they have rights and remedies which they can use to help get more meaningful and effective stakeholder engagement. Why? Because that really leads to development impact and effectiveness. And when it is not done, all the costs which are shown in a slide are more likely to follow. And those costs are borne by the people of the country and through their government's inefficient implementation of stakeholder engagement. So it is a very important for civil society to know about it and to engage. Now, they can play many roles, which we just discussed, but they face many constraints, civil society organizations. And these constraints include, first of all, lack of awareness about the stakeholder engagement policy, rights, remedies, good practices, what to do, how to do it, insufficient capacity among the civil society, government authorities, and citizens, and inadequate financing. I think to do a effective job, the money will not come from the government. The government is already spending the money to do the actual stakeholder engagement. They are not going to fund and should not fund, and the civil society will not accept the funds to hold the government accountable for a good job. That money has to come from some third-party sources, and this is very important. And the last part is inadequate willingness of authorities and citizens and World Bank staff. Now, the point I want to finish with is that local CSOs can help only if these constraints can be addressed. How to do it, of course, will vary from situation to situation. Next slide, please. But I want to end my presentation by pointing out that we will include in the presentation a slide which tells you where to get more information and offer more information both from about the projects in your country, stakeholder engagement plans in your country, as well as the overall policy of the World Bank, and an offer that if any of you want to know more about stakeholder engagement and want to do something in this area, you can reach out to PTF. I have given my email as well as our organization's email. And thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to share this with you. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Vinay, and thank you, Asla, as well, for taking us through that presentation. We have got a question here from Anne-Marie, so I'll ask that first, and then we can go on afterwards to answer some general questions. But the question here is, how do SEPs ensure the inclusion of marginalized and vulnerable groups in a meaningful way to address concerns about elite capture, accessibility, cultural barriers, and power dynamics, to ensure that it's not just a checkbox exercise, but truly impactful?
Asla, you want to go ahead?
So I can start with that. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for the question. And I mean, it is a real challenge, right? The question really touches on something that's critical for development, right? How do we ensure real inclusion, try to address issues of elite capture? I mean, I would say one of the things that I think that's really powerful about the environmental and social framework, and we didn't actually touch on that standard, but for instance, we do have a separate policy on indigenous peoples. That's even separate from the stakeholder engagement policy, which is broader. And one of the reasons for having a policy like that is to work with, let's say, in a project that affects indigenous territories, to work with organizations that are inherent to the indigenous peoples of that area. And so it is a mandate to consult And depending on the project's actual, depending on the project, there's also a process called FPIC. I don't know if you've heard about this, free, prior, and informed consultation. Or in some cases, they also have a right to have consent, meaning that projects cannot go through if the indigenous communities in that project area has given their green light in certain cases. So this is one way of doing this in a real meaningful way, particularly, in a group like indigenous peoples that have been historically discriminated against in a lot of different contexts. So I'm primarily talking about it from a Latin America perspective, which, where they have, I think, more established rights also in the eyes of the government. And I understand that not everywhere is the same situation, but this is just one example. I think the other thing, again, going back to the stakeholder engagement policy, is that when you look at stakeholder engagement plans, there's a lot of procedures there to engage communities in separate ways. So there are, of course, a lot of processes that's about bringing everybody together, but there's also a lot of targeted consultations and targeted engagement that takes place. Again, on the cultural aspect, I will give you an example from Afghanistan, right? Doing stakeholder engagement in Afghanistan. You'll see a lot of situations there where, women are consulted separately by women facilitators, who understand the communities. So depending on the situation, or if it's, let's say Haitians in Dominican Republic, right? You will bring people who can speak to the language and talk and, respond to their concerns. So I think this is one way, this is one thing that you'll see a lot in the World Bank, is to have these very targeted engagement by facilitators that have more understanding and represents the group itself.
Thank you, Aslam. We have another question from Gavin Welberg. What is the best way to approach utilizing this process by a commercial organization for profit, wishing to and capable of deploying value-added solutions into countries where governments may not have the cash to invest? For example, providing international certifiable relevant training through the establishment of appropriate training facilities and trainers, etc.
So, I think this again depends on the project itself. But one thing that you're seeing more and more in World Bank investments is this public-private partnership. So I think in situations where the government, does not have the funds, so they're really trying to bring some private sector partners, whether that partnership is on co-financing a certain investment or certain activity, or whether you're bringing the private sector for training purposes. So I think there are more opportunities than ever to do that in World Bank projects because of this push to have, bring private sector solutions into development, and that the solutions won't just come from the public sector side.
I think if I may add to that, Mark, it is the stakeholder engagement policy also applies to the World Bank's International Financial Corporation, and that finances private sector projects. And it is important that all those costs of poor stakeholder engagement are equally applicable to private sector investments. Therefore, what Aslam mentioned, the social license for the private sector. So I think of many private sector projects where the public support for the companies is important, and many private sector companies will spend in building that support, and that's why most corporations have foundations which will get engaged to build the community support and invest as part of this. Many of them big projects include stakeholder investment. So it is important for them to have a budget for stakeholder engagement in private sector projects as well as government projects. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Dinesh. Vinay, what would you say have been the most valuable lessons that you've learned since since this began?
So I can start on that. I think for me, one of the most valuable lessons that I learned since especially ESF, the World Bank's environmental and social framework kicked in and mandated this policy for all of our investment projects, is that I think we can't expect the same rigor in every project. So I think we really have to look at this from a risk-based perspective. And I think this is something we're doing a bit more, right? So we're about what, 6 and 7 year into the ESF implementation. And I think at the beginning, we were trying to do the same thing in every project, right? To have this, you know, having SEPs that looked kind of similar, trying to push to do same rigorous level of engagement. And I think this is honestly have not worked really well. And it doesn't make sense, right? So because, you know, there are projects that are really kind of low risk in terms of exclusion risks. And then you have projects that are, you know, hydropower, I mean, energy. So I think the level of investments we need to put in to the stakeholder engagement in a project like that is so much more than a project that's maybe, you know, rehabilitating a building, right? That's in like a rural area, which is not surrounded by, you know, a large group of people. So I think this is one. How do we do things in a way that's proportionate to the risk and impact? And then the second lesson I learned is a little bit building on what I said earlier, is that I think it's really important who engages, right? Again, I think we were more focused initially on setting up the processes, the procedures and requirements. But as we looked at the implementation experiences, it does make a difference as to who are the ones engaging, understanding the context, the history of community government relations in that area, which again will affect, right, the outcomes. And then the third thing is, I think we've been trying a lot at the World Bank to make the documentation very rigorous, you know, stakeholder engagement plan. And you can have a perfect plan, but it doesn't mean that the plan will translate into reality. So I think now the efforts are more being pushed from, let's have a more flexible and leaner plan, understanding that things will change. It's impossible to know everything from the start. So what matters is that there's adaptive management and adaptive learning that's built into it. You know, you start out with an idea, with a plan, but if things don't go as well, you know, how can you adjust? And have this feedback loop, right, throughout the project cycle. As Vinay said, you report out, you get more feedback, you try to make incremental changes. So I think that adaptive learning project process is very important for good stakeholder engagement.
I may add to that. I think from the civil society perspective, you know, everybody will tell you that stakeholder engagement involves transaction costs. There are transaction costs for the government. There are transaction costs for the World Bank. There are transaction costs for the communities and citizens. And there are transaction costs for the social intermediaries and civil society organizations. I think the implementation effectiveness requires that there are adequate systems and mechanisms to cover the transaction costs for everybody. Unfortunately, while the government and the World Bank usually take care of their own transaction costs, that is not the case for civil society. And the donors and others have not really set up effective ways to cover those transaction costs and help them. And that hampers the effective stakeholder engagement in many ways. And that is the reason why, unfortunately, now, as we have learned, the effective stakeholder engagement, the costs involved all on behalf of all parties, government, World Bank, citizens, communities, and the civil society, those costs are far less than the cost of poor stakeholder engagement.
Mm.
I think how to get this message to the supporters of civil society and communities out that they need to step up to support to cover the transaction costs involved for the civil society is extremely important. And I don't have an answer for that. It will, of course, vary from country to country, donor to donor, etc. But this is one of the things we struggle when we are trying to help local civil society organizations from PTF. We have to work with them and say, look, how in your country, what is the funding landscape, and where can you get some support for you to effectively do the roles which we discussed. Over to you.
Mm. Have you been able to measure the success or the return on the money that has been invested in these projects? Have you seen an improvement as these stakeholder plans are improved?
Well, certainly, as Aslam mentioned, there is enough evidence. The underlying processes of stakeholder engagement, access to information, meaningful consultations, grievance redress, beneficiary feedback collection, these have been in practice for more than 2 decades in development projects. And there is enough evidence to show that when these are effectively done, they
Mm.
make an improvement in the results. The stakeholder engagement policy itself, as we said, was, all these activities were grouped under stakeholder engagement policy only in 2018 or so
Mm.
by the World Bank. But under different other policies, the World Bank has been doing it, these 4 basic activities for a long time. And there is enough evidence inside the World Bank and outside the World Bank. We have recently done a study in PTF, which we can make available, which has a review of the evidence, which is available on effectiveness of citizen and civil society engagement.
Okay. And you mentioned that colossal amount of $400 billion. Is this amount likely to increase over the years or decrease, or will it depend on the success of the programs?
I think this 400 billion is a dynamic number because uh, the project takes 4 or 5 years to implement. So every year, new projects are approved and older ones get closed.
Hmm.
So I think you can expect not wild fluctuations, but plus or minus 50 billion at a given time is reasonable. And the stock of portfolio around 2,000 projects is pretty stable over the decades.
Okay.
But the World Bank in last year made adopted a big IDA replenishment package and financing mechanism, which will increase its annual its lending by more than $50 billion.
Okay.
So it is on the growth path until, of course, Trump got elected. So now we don't know
Yeah.
whether that growth path, how effective that will be. But
Hmm.
prior to his election, the US and the UK foreign aid cuts, the World Bank was well on the path to expand its financing operations.
Okay. We don't have any other questions there, but I see actually we're coming to the end of the session now. So I just want to thank you both for a great session, very informative, and it's a nice follow-up to our previous session that we did with you guys. What's next for your team? Are you planning any future events to share this information?
Well, we certainly, from PTF side, we are working with our partners. About 10 days ago, we had a webinar similar to this for our partners in Ghana. We are working in South Asia to deliver similar things. We also had, so basically, first constraint is the lack of awareness about it and the opportunity. And then where there is a specific interest, then we will work with the local civil society organizations to see if we can help address some of the constraints so they can more effectively participate. And the World Bank has its own program for improving effectiveness of stakeholder engagement. And maybe Asla might want to comment on that. Thank you.
Yes, I was actually on the what's next and other opportunities for, similar events for civil society or the public. I wanted to mention that World Bank also organize, being the large organization that it is, there are, regular events that are organized and all kinds of different issues that are open to the public and civil society. In fact, sort of one of the main events that are coming up next month is the World Bank Spring Meetings. That's going to happen on April 21st to 26th. And usually they have several events that are open to civil society organizations where you can also attend online. So I would, encourage colleagues to keep an eye on those spring meetings related events where there are big announcements are made, and sort of it's a good sort of networking and an engagement platform. Also, just on what's next on sort of the stakeholder engagement policy. So right now, the ESF itself is going through what's called a streamlining process, which means is that, we're taking stock of 7 or 8 years of implementation experience at this point, and trying to make some adjustments as to how we can better improve the implementation and outcomes, and not only the documentation and preparation stage of these projects and these plans and instruments. So I'm also happy if there's interest to kind of keep those public and civil society organizations engaged or informed to the extent that I'm able to. So please do keep an eye on what's coming up. Vinay and I are in constant touch, so I'm also happy to relay some information through Vinay. Thank you.
Perfect. Great, lovely. So as we draw this event to close, I'd like to offer our thanks to Dr. Vinay and for Asla for your participation today. So I personally love to learn about these projects, which are doing so much good and improving people's lives. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing these stories for us, and I truly hope that this can continue to expand as you go forward. So thank you to our audience. We really appreciate the support, and I hope that we'll see you again at our next event on the 17th of March. And for anyone that missed all or part of this session, we will be sharing a recording on our YouTube channel, as well as an audio version on our podcast channel. So thank you again to our speakers and to our audience, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
And thank you, Mark, for the invitation. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Pleasure.